Hi, welcome to everyone who's here from the Credo team and to everyone watching on Facebook. I'm Heidi Hess. I'm one of the co-directors of Credo Action, and I'm here with Shaunna Thomas, the executive director of UltraViolet. Shaunna has a long history as a progressive organizer and activist, and UltraViolet is one of Credo's best partners when it comes to fighting for gender equity and against sexism and misogyny, whether in Washington, D.C., on college campuses, or even in corporations in our own backyard here in San Francisco. There's more I could say, but we're really here to be in conversation together. So I'm going to start with a question that I hope will let you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about UltraViolet. Just how and why you and Nita started 6 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here, to be able to meet the team at Credo. We admire the work that you all do so much. And it's been a privilege to be working in partnership with you since we launched really in 2012. Like the one progressive organization that we can rely on to show up for gender equity and justice every single time. And it's really unique and we really value it. And in fact, this plays into the story behind why we launched, which was when we were, looking at the landscape. Actually, I'm going to take it one step further back. Nita Chaudhry is my co-founder, and she and I had been working together for a couple of years. She was a campaign director at MoveOn.org, and I was working with MoveOn and Democracy for America and Credo to some extent at the time, and Progressive Change Campaign Committee, to really try and leverage what was for a short time a democratically controlled Congress and a democratically controlled White House to make sure that the legislation that was coming through was as responsive to the people who got us there in the first place, which is to say the progressive base. And every single time we were on the verge of passing some major piece of legislation, and that was the healthcare bill, or it could have been a tax cut bill, literally the last remaining votes required to pass with a Democratic majority was a rider, usually an abortion rider, that would throw women under the bus explicitly to get the last remaining Democratic votes, which is obviously a terrible dynamic for women. So basically the calculus in DC is if you want to get anything done, you have to undermine women's access to the health care they need in order to do it. Yep. So we looked around and said, what's going on here? Why is this keep happening? And Planned Parenthood is doing incredible work. There are a number of organizations in the women's space who are doing, National Women's Law Center, National Partnership for Women and Families that have major lobbying apparatuses. So it's not because women's interests aren't being represented on Capitol Hill. There are big organizing apparatuses. I mean, it didn't take that long to observe that there hadn't yet been the application of technology-enabled rapid response, mass mobilization type organizing applied to women's issues, so that when women's fundamental rights were under assault or attack, that there would be a nimble, flexible community of people who could, who could send a warning that if you do this, you will pay a cost. And we came to Credo, we went to MoveOn, and a couple other organizations said, we're thinking about this gap. And everyone said, great, somebody should build it. And because at the time, the thinking, and I think this was right, is that it was really going to take a community that was dedicated to the broad spectrum of issues that women deal with every single day to really be attuned to the threats and to have the community that was necessary in place and ready to do the accountability work. It wasn't enough to have a bunch of progressive organizations sort of jumping into the fight periodically. That Credo and others needed to be allies in that, but that there needed to be this dedicated community. We came to agree, and and in 2012, we started having these conversations at the end of 2011 and 2012, before we even had a website up. But we had like a theory, which was that there were millions of people who were with us on the issues, but hadn't yet been activated in the way that they had become used to taking action, which is through their social media sites, through getting notified in the moment that they've been inspired or outraged with a credible way of making a difference, and then being able to take that action collectively and see an outcome. Right? That was the theory. We didn't know how exactly we were going to launch, but in February of 2012, you all were involved in this in a very big way at Credo. The Komen Foundation, right, decided that they were going to defund Planned Parenthood's breast health program. to anybody paying close attention, I mean, this was really the first major like mass mobilization, online driven, really mass mobilization in defense of women's access to healthcare services and in defense of Planned Parenthood. I mean, this was a huge moment. I remember talking to Becky Bond and a couple other people at the time who said that that petition, when it launched, was one of the most successful ever in Credo's history, and that told us a lot. And it was true for Move On as well. And it was through that campaign. Move On essentially put a checkbox for us on their email. They said, if you're interested in this campaign, you want to do more of it, sign up for UltraViolet. We went from 0 to 250,000, members overnight, and we obviously had to get our website up. And it was sort of off to the races from there. We went straight from there to a birth control fight in Congress, to basically taking Rush Limbaugh's advertisers, taking Rush Limbaugh down by denying him of his advertisers in a partnership with Media Matters. So, yeah, it went from this very, distressing observation to a community that was ready to do the accountability work that needed to get done. And here we are, a very, very, very different political and cultural context. And I think in large part because of the work that all of us have been able to do together to show that sexism is a real thing, right? And that there are millions of people who are willing to and interested in demanding accountability in the moments when women's lives are being threatened. So.
Yeah, thank you. It's, it's someone in the Credo team is talking and I can hear them, so sorry, Facebook land, you couldn't. It's interesting thinking about how much we had to fight with the Democratic president and Democratic Congress, and then a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. And now we have a very different situation. So on the one hand, right, like we've made space for this conversation that didn't exist before. On the other hand, we have a really different fight on our hands. So how's it different, maybe a little bit more in both of those ways now to do the work that you guys are doing?
So over the past year, I would say, well, really since Trump's election, I mean, the shock of the election, I mean, it wasn't shocking to everybody, but on some level, there was, at least in terms of the politics, there was an expectation that 2017 was going to be very different from the year that it was. And, but really it was the campaign, right, and the Access Hollywood tapes and the media and sort of public response to that really got us thinking in a very different way about the role that we needed to play and kind of where we are culturally and politically. So just to put it into some context, in 2012, not only were we dealing with a Democratic Party that wasn't committed to a core set of values with respect to women. Thank God we're past that. But also, culturally, we weren't talking about sexism. It wasn't a thing, right? We were, one of our biggest frustrations when we launched was that even with a progressive audience, when we named sexism, if we alluded to sexism, that was okay. We allude to, something that had a sexist outcome, people wanted to do the accountability. But you name sexism or forget patriarchy, right? As a root cause, people just didn't participate in the campaigns. It was almost like a bridge too far. We were living in this kind of post-sexist, mythological, psychological space. My favorite anecdote is somebody asked Beyonce in an interview, I don't remember the publication now, and said, are you a feminist? And she said, well, she kind of hedged. She said, I believe in women's equality, but I don't know if I'd call myself a feminist. And that was really common, right? I mean, fast forward to today, and that's literally her brand. Right? She's a feminist. Her daughter wears a feminist T-shirt, right? So things have come a long way, and the opposition's voice has also become louder. And Trump is president, right? Misogyny controls the country. Yep. So what do you do, right? In this scenario in which the noise on both sides is more powerful even than it was before. And when your whole model is really driven in a lot of ways by rapid response organizing, the majority of what you're doing and what you're focused on is necessarily accountability. And accountability is clearly important. We can't we can't call that done just because Harvey Weinstein's not
Right.
in, doesn't have influence in the, film industry anymore. Doesn't mean we've checked that box and we're done, obviously. But it does mean that we do have more power, even if it's the case that misogynists, right, are control a lot. We do have more power than we had before, and it is a time in which we need to recognize that, right? Step into it a bit. Put forward, I think, what we have the opportunity to do now, I should say, is to put forward a really compelling vision for what a post-sexist, post-patriarchal society looks like. Be willing to talk about what post-Me Too life is like for the average person day to day. And so it's actually just, I think, a much deeper level of accountability that needs to happen. It's not just about figureheads or symbols of power, but the human-to-human accountability that needs to happen. There needs to be, and really putting forward, I think, or engaging in a strategy that can not just, is not just about changing policy, although that's very, very important, but also shifting culture in a really fundamental way. And reflecting back to the world when culture change happens. So, we're probably getting into a subject that may have come up later, but I'm just gonna raise it. Right. Like, the Me Too movement, launched first of all, to say that this is sort of the first time people have paid attention to sexual assault or harassment in this country is not true. Right. And it is definitely the most participated in, right? Like mainstream conversation we've ever seen. And it's very, very exciting and probably a direct result of who's in office, who our president is, I would argue. But it's also very much changed the conversations people have at work with their spouses. What we, in conversations with organizers and activists from the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the Farm Workers and Restaurant Opportunity Center and our own members, what we see and understand is that, yes, we have a long way to go, and the story, particularly around women of color, is not being told enough. And there are policy solutions there that we need to get into. But the fact that change is happening, that people are nervous, right? Nervousness are uncomfortable is progress, right? It's important, and it's important to acknowledge it. It's important to point to it, because guess what? This thing is not getting solved next week, right? But we have to be aware of where we are on the arc of change, and part of that is kind of telling the story about the change that is happening and being able to articulate why it matters, and where ultimately we're trying to go. So that is a very long way of saying we still need to be taking advantage of tipping point moments, those unpredictable moments when people are alerted to a problem and are inspired or outraged enough to do something, sometimes for the first time, and be an on-ramp for new activists. We have to do that, and we have to do the accountability. But we also need to, take on some responsibility of that forward vision and long-term campaigns that will fundamentally change institutions, and do some, and get into education, get into sex education, get into consent education, and treat, and understand that people, we have arrived here as a culture for a reason, and be willing to dig into what those reasons are. Yep. And deal with them,
Yep. Well, so let's stay on Me Too for just a second.
Sure.
You guys asked, now what, to your members and with partners, us and other partners. What did you learn about what's next, or now what, and then what's next to do about that?
Yeah, it was fascinating, and I would like to do this every week if I could, because I wonder, I think that people's sophistication around the problem is actually actively changing, and people's understanding of it, their personal relationship to it is evolving. And so, but at this moment in time that we did this question, this was a little bit earlier this year, the number one response that we got when we had a list of possible, responses, and then we had an open submission. The number one open submission item was to hold Trump accountable, to get him removed from office, because what he represents, and and not just the things he's actually done, but the culture that he promotes and propagates is so offensive to people, as you would think
Right.
and hope, is profound enough that they feel like that should be our #1 priority. The second thing that we heard a lot, and I was really encouraged by this, was that people want to, and I just mentioned this a little bit, but people really want to look at sex education. They want to look at consent education. They want to see, an attempt that is more comprehensive than anything, even when sex education was actually a thing in public schools, which it actually really isn't anymore.
Yep.
But before the the religious rights assault on sex education, there were at least facts being presented to people about their body. Even that's not there anymore. But we have an even more urgent problem, which is that men and women don't communicate face to face anymore. Right? Like people don't ask each other out face to face anymore. So the odds of somebody knowing what to do and like their first real like human to human interaction is in an intimate setting. Are they going to start to all of a sudden ask for permission to do things? Probably. I mean, no. Right? Is what we've learned. People also don't really understand what consent is. That's something we've known since we started doing this work in 2012. Even journalists, when we would the first major campaign we ran in this area was ran a case in Steubenville.
Yep.
I don't know if you all remember that, but it was horrific. This rape was captured on social media, and the journalists who wanted to cover this basically said to us, well, did she, in this case, it was very clear to them she was passed out and it was very straightforward, but they wanted to have a conversation about the less clear-cut cases. And we said, no, it's not less clear-cut. It's very straightforward. There's consent or there isn't. And it was just like, they were incredibly incredulous on this whole point. So anyway, we know that this is an issue. There's lots of ways to go about it. I mean, we got some people writing in about organizing PTAs. State houses are, notoriously very difficult to navigate around anything in the education system. So this is a very, very uphill, suggestion that has been put out there. But it doesn't mean that. But it is possible that people recognize the problem enough. They recognize the pervasiveness enough that there will be an openness to educating at least high school students, but honestly, it needs to be in middle school. So that was the next big thing. And then beyond that, there was a lot on the adjudication side. And that's not totally surprising, right? Most of like the big efforts that people are investing in right now that has gotten a lot of press has been on the, how do you support survivors, survivor justice. We do a lot of survivor justice work. It makes sense. But when the first like major fundraise for a solution or for a way to address this was a legal fund, right, driven by Time's Up, $20 million. That's now being facilitated by National Women's Law Center, so that's great. But the big question, I think, what our members put ahead of the adjudication side was, why don't we do something to prevent the harassment and the discrimination and the assault from happening in the first place? For UltraViolet, we agree that that's like the right role for us to be playing, and so that's the big focus of our work right now.
That's great. I have a 4th grader, so I'm a 4th grade boy, and I think we talked about it already, and I feel like his school is not doing enough. And so yes, like high school, middle school, super early.
All of it. I just heard this really disturbing stat, and somebody told me this, so look it up before you repeat it. but
Note to everyone.
I tried to look it up, and there's like a lot of different sources on it. But but this is true in California apparently. So you may know this already. That 55% of middle schoolers are engaging in oral sex. So if you're not talking to middle schoolers about consent, then we've totally missed the boat, right?
Yep.
So even if it's not that high, it's still significantly higher than I would have ever guessed.
Yes.
So
right. My 4-year-old doesn't like to get kisses, and so we've been practicing a lot about, I really want to kiss you because I'm your mom. If you don't want to, I'm going to model.
You get to say no.
You having permission to tell me not to give you kisses. Darn it.
I do that with my daughter too. I told my husband, if my daughter says no, like I'm not, I don't want to be hugged right now, your job is to say, okay.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Right.
I'm walking away, right?
And it's a lot to unlearn and a lot of patterns of, wow, I just expect to be able to kiss you because I'm your mom. And a lot of people think that they should be able to kiss and do, and it's like, okay, right, this is the muscle we have to build in them so early. Okay, so when you guys figure out the curriculum, I'll be doing it at home. So that will be really good for me. So, you know, attacks on Planned Parenthood just this week, right? Title IX. We talked about sex education. We talked about birth control. We know abortion rights. Not only sort of in the reproductive justice space, but also attacks on immigrant families, separating them at the border, having them, you know, feel terrorized to take their kids to school. And, you know, so there's a lot of grim, but I think that you guys are also having some victories. So, you know.
In that context, it's hard to think about. Yes,
right,
no,
well,
I agree. Yes, we've had some victories, and it's totally worth talking about.
Yes.
I agree.
I think it is. So
it is. Look, yeah, this is an incredibly challenging time, right? I mean, everybody understands that we're facing crises that we haven't. You know, I was just at a conference today where a couple of speakers referenced the fact that we're facing like a crisis of our democracy that, you know, has been unmatched since the Civil War. We're facing. You know, we're also facing somewhat of a cultural and political kind of awakening that we also haven't seen in a very long time. Like, and I like to keep reminding people we're seeing a resurgence of activism, and that is really crucial to the preservation of our democracy and our society. It's under a massive stress test, as this other person was saying, and we get to either come out of it or we don't. But right now, like public engagement suggests that, like, you know, if we do emerge from it. It will be hopefully a radically changed version. That's what we're here. That's why we do this work, right? Because we believe that that's possible. You know, I would say that there are victories on a cultural level, and then there have been policy victories as well. But we are much, you know, when we think about what's happening on a national level, this has been much more of a cultural space that we've been operating in than a policy one. And, you know, so at the national level, the fact that, so we worked very closely with the New York Times on the Weinstein piece, and the reason that happened is because we worked really closely with the New York Times on the O'Reilly situation. And they, coming out of the O'Reilly, I think you all were involved in that, and Color Change and Now and Media Matters. It was a big, you know, coalition of groups who recognized that there was an opening, a vulnerability at Fox, and that we could take out kind of one of the worst guys there, worse on so many levels. It's not, I mean, I don't know that I need to explain why. I think people know why O'Reilly was a worthy target. But the New York Times did this incredible job of doing this investigative journalism, exposing who he was behind the scenes, and the fact that Fox News was allowing it to continue in there by creating an extremely unsafe environment for their staff, for the people who work there. And that victory had a huge ripple effect on Fox as an organization, as we understand it internally. It started a lot of conversations about how they needed to be doing things differently. And the editorial board essentially got together and said, this was powerful, we want to do this again. So they called a lot of us who had been involved in that and said, who should we take on next? We had just had a conversation with Rose McGowan like the month before. And we said, okay, well, this is totally unlikely to work. And we're definitely going to get sued. And it's going to be very, very painful. But Harvey Weinstein is the big fish if you want to take on, you know, the entertainment industry. And 6 months later, we're all bracing, and we've got like our accountability campaigns lined up, and we're gonna, you know, we're gonna petition the company to remove him, and we're gonna petition Amazon to drop their deal that they had just entered into with the Weinstein Company. Well, we didn't have to do any of that. We also didn't have to lawyer up quite as much as we thought, because, you know, it struck such a chord with so many people that the accountability happened on its own, right? And that then, of course, like, created space for Tarana Burke's Me Too movement, right, that has so deeply I mean, not sufficiently, and we're not done here, but so has really impressively destigmatized the whole notion of being, coming forward and acknowledging, admitting. Somebody called it the other day to me to having been sexually assaulted or harassed, is been incredible. And so I just, on a meta level, I would say that that's not an UltraViolet specific victory, but it was, it's one that we're really proud of having played a role in and helped to set the stage for, and hopefully and multiple kind of points of accountability have happened since then that we have helped to win, like the MSU, Michigan State University president resigning over essentially ignoring the gymnastics team's doctor's treatment of the U.S. Olympic gymnasts. Steve Wynn, dozens of people came forward and said he had sexually harassed. I mean, basically everyone who ever worked for him, it seems like at one point, he sexually harassed. He was considered to be untouchable. He would have been considered untouchable for sure a year ago. I think even in this context, it was considered a tough person to bring down. But we ran a campaign that ultimately led to him resigning from the board of directors and losing his position there entirely. The Atlantic hired a journalist who is one of the most racist, sexist people to have ever been hired by which should be a very kind of respectable publication, thereby really normalizing his view to an extent. We worked with NARAL to get him fired, and he was. Yep. So there have been, there are moments where collective action has led to, an outcome that has been really important, not just for the people who our targets have touched directly, but for the larger conversation happening in the world that we're excited about. There's also, a lot happening at the local level. That I'm sure a lot of Credo members are sort of directly involved in, whether it's civic engagement stuff that and victories around turnout that we're about to see, or policy victories that we've also been a part of. There's been a lot of movement around paid sick leave that's happened in places like New Jersey and Illinois and Florida. I'm totally blanking on my whole list of states here for some reason. There's so many, I can't remember them. No, but there are. The momentum is really impressive, and what I think what we're seeing is that at least with the organizations that we work with that are really deeply rooted in local communities, is that the activism is really intense, that people, when there is a really tangible goal to strap onto, people are, excited and showing up for them, and it's exciting to be a part of that in any small way, whether it's driving our members to the grassroots lobbying, day with their state senator, or whether we're flying a plane, over the headquarters of a building, and we do all those things.
I think we're almost out of time, so I wanted to see if anyone in the audience has a question before we finish. Okay. Seeing none, do I get to ask one more, or should we close up? Okay. All right. I'm going to ask one more.
Okay.
Speaking of planes.
Yes.
And speaking of, to me, another place we're in this moment where we know that the president and the Congress are somewhat too all the way intransigent. Corporations have a role to play. So a campaign that we've been working on together is to get Google to pull down ads for crisis pregnancy centers. So crisis pregnancy centers mislead women. They often locate next door to clinics that actually provide real advice about reproductive health care and provide abortions. They try to shame women. They give them incorrect, misleading medical advice. And you guys worked with NARAL a few years ago to get them to pull the ads down. The ads are back. So, we've had, working with UltraViolet is we have so much fun because we've had bike billboards following Google buses through the streets of San Francisco in the last few weeks. We had a light projection at night. You guys are gonna fly a plane at some point. So I guess thinking about that campaign just a little bit in terms of sort of the outsider role in pushing on corporations, and then a little bit like what the insider role is. I think we're sort of in the little bit of the outside push.
I would say we're squarely in the outside push.
Fine. And I think, but we have partners who are doing something different. So I don't know if you can just take a minute to talk about that.
Yeah. Crisis pregnancy centers, or as we like to call them, like sham clinics, designed literally to discourage women from understanding all the options available to them when they get pregnant. We need a shorter name, but that is, the crisis pregnancy center is such a misnomer for what they do. It's a real threat, and at the same time, I'm really excited about the Supreme Court case that is really calling into question their legitimacy by potentially requiring them to tell parents that they don't actually have medical license, right? They have people walking around in doctor's coats spewing literal bullshit about, can I say that on Facebook?
I think so.
About, anyway, about things around which they don't know anything from a medical perspective, and actually are lying about it, saying things like, if you have an abortion, you might never be able to have children again. I mean, they're really deplorable institutions. And for a company like Google, which obviously has a number of flaws, one of them is not that they have at least from a rhetorical standpoint or a branding standpoint, really tried to position themselves as like a company that cares about women when it comes to their employees and when it comes to just the world at large. So they obviously have, we see them having an opportunity here to prove it by not lending legitimacy to these CPCs. We, yes, I think Credo and UltraViolet, our special brand of organizing is that we're not negotiating, right? It's very clear what needs to happen. They need to not allow CPCs to advertise, crisis pregnancy centers to advertise. There's absolutely no reason for them to enable these centers to defraud and fail women in such dangerous, life-threatening at times, ways. However, there is certainly a role for, and there's always going to be, right, somebody who needs to be having the direct conversation with Google. It's often important that those two roles are really separate, right? Because once you're in a conversation, it's very hard to be pushing from the outside. And one of the tactics that corporations like to use is to pretend to engage in a negotiation so that you're sort of holding fire with the expectation that negotiation might go your way. Sometimes you have to, right? In this case, I think it's really helpful that we have a partner at Planned Parenthood that has a long-standing relationship with Google and therefore is able to build on that relationship to have a conversation, and were that to result in something good for women, then that's great, right? We hope that happens. We just also know that when two parties are at a table negotiating, it's helpful for there to be noise outside the door. And outside the door of that room, and so that's what we bring to that conversation. A little bit of uncomfortableness that's healthy. Right?
Noise outside the door.
Noise outside the door.
That is a great way to finish. So I think it's time for us to wrap up. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much to the whole UltraViolet team, who we count on so much as great partners. Thanks to the Credo members who have helped us donate almost $130,000 to UltraViolet through the Credo donations program. And thanks to everybody who's watching for tuning in. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.